So, I gave him a false address, as I had planned before picking up the phone. Brian showed up there at night, taking advantage of the darkness and the silence of the night. He sneaked into the house without being seen, and just as he was in the middle of his search for documents in the supposed notary's office, he was caught in the act by a security guard whom I had hired expressly for that day, knowing that Brian would probably try something like this. The guard beat him up, using the baseball bat he had brought with him upon discovering an intruder in the office, and Brian ended up jailed for breaking and entering. Hi, my name is Maureen. I was never someone who enjoyed causing conflict, and fortunately, I could say that all the relationships I had until my adulthood proceeded relatively smoothly, without anyone being seriously hurt by the actions of the other. So, I thought my relationship with Brian would be the same way, that we would complement each other in our own way, and there would be no reason for absurd fights or unnecessary separations. I had met him at work when we were assigned to the same department, and we had been friends for over 2 years before we decided to take the next step. So what could go wrong? Brian was kind and attentive, and he seemed to get along well with Lily, my younger sister. That's why I felt confident enough to ask him to move in with us and eventually say yes to him at the altar.
I'm glad Brian moved in with us, so you won't be alone anymore.
But was I alone before? I had you.
You know what I mean? How long has it been since you went out with someone?
The truth was, it had been ages. Since I graduated from college, at least. It's not that I didn't want to be in a relationship, it's just that a few years ago, I found myself in a situation where my parents suddenly passed away in a car accident. And, with this tragedy, I had no choice but to take custody of Lily, my younger sister, who also became paralyzed in that accident. Truth be told, it was a miracle that Lily had survived it all, despite all the damage to her legs and the psychological recovery that followed through attending numerous therapy sessions over the years. But she had improved a lot, to the point that if it weren't for having to use her wheelchair to go anywhere, she could be any other teenager, with her own dreams and ambitions. I was very proud of her, and although I had to pause my romantic life to be able to give her all the attention she demanded, I didn't regret it at all.
Lily is more independent than you think. You should give her a bit more freedom.
I know I'm somewhat overprotective sometimes, but I can't help it. I've been taking care of her since she was 8, and we don't have any more close relatives. Lily is still a teenager.
How come you don't have any more family?
My parents were the only ones, well, the only close ones. We also have some distant uncles on my father's side, who have a chain of supermarkets on the other side of the country. We don't see them much, actually, so I wouldn't count them as relatives per se.
I guess it's never too late to reconnect.
I thought Brian asked those questions out of mere curiosity, and I suppose to some extent he did. We had been married for a few months, and Brian had agreed to adopt Lily as his own daughter, thus sharing custody with me. It was a decision we all made together, as a family, obviously having consulted the main interested party. Lily was already 15 years old and was ecstatic that Brian had joined our small family, so it didn't take her long to think about it when we both suggested the possibility of him adopting her. Brian was charming, and Lily absolutely trusted my judgment in choosing a stable partner with whom to put down roots. It was a pity, therefore, that things with Brian didn't work out, and that, barely 9 months into our marriage, we ended up divorced. This is important, Lily. Brian and I are going to separate, but since legally he is also your legal guardian, theoretically he should continue to share custody with me, unless before a judge you choose to stay only with me.
But why? Don't you want to see him anymore?
I would prefer not to, even though we've separated on friendly terms. Although, if it's important to you and you want to keep seeing him, we can arrange for you to visit him every weekend. How does that sound?
No, The truth is, I would prefer to stay with him instead of being with you.
That confession, made somewhat timidly, hit me like a cold shower. How could my own sister prefer my ex over me? It didn't make sense. Or, thinking about it again, maybe it did. I had been very busy lately with work to pay more attention to my little sister. And although I didn't neglect her, always making sure to be there to provide when needed, it was true that I had become the prototype of a strict mother. I wasn't strict in the sense that I punished Lily often or imposed tasks too complicated to fulfill, but compared to Brian's parenting style. Brian was the type of parent who spoiled his children too much, giving them every gift and promise they asked for, indulging them in everything without considering expenses or the long-term consequences. At first, I thought Brian was like that because he cared about Lily and, well, because we were family. But now I began to doubt his intentions. What if it had all been a plan to take her away from me from the beginning? It didn't even make sense the way we had separated.
I thought he had deceived you. Wasn't that the case?
No, or at least I don't believe so. Overnight, he told me he no longer felt anything for me, and that it was better for us to separate. That was all. No fights or arguments. He said it in a tone as neutral as if he were dismissing an employee.
That's not normal at all. You seemed very close when you were together.
And I want to think we were, but now I have my doubts. When Lily suggested that he have full custody, he made no effort to try to convince her to stay with me. On the contrary, he provided all the facilities for him to be awarded legal custody.
Why would he do such a thing? It seems like he even ended up saying he cheated on you with someone else just to give you an excuse to accept the divorce.
I didn't understand it at first, but very soon I did. One day I received an anonymous email detailing Brian's plans. From the email, it seemed Brian had been bragging in a bar after drinking about how wealthy he would soon become. It turned out Brian knew that my parents had left a lot of money for Lily, and she would only get access to it when she turned 18. So, in the meantime, whoever had custody or took care of her had access to her fortunes. The issue was, I had a job and didn't spend a dime of Lily's money. And yes, it was true that if Brian had stayed married to me, he would still have benefited from the situation. But really, it was not the same to be the spouse of a rich couple as to be the legal guardian of a minor in possession of such a sum. With Lily in his care, Brian would have free rein to manage and spend Lily's estate as he pleased. Brian had calculated everything so that not long after we went our separate ways, he could already gain access to Lily's bank accounts. What am I supposed to do? I need to regain custody before Brian spends all of Lily's inheritance.
He won't be able to do that. Even though he is her legal guardian and has permanent custody, in the will of your parents, it's made clear that only you have the right to manage your sister's fortune.
In other words, he can't access the accounts no matter how much he wants to.
That's right. He doesn't have permission. Not now, nor when Lily reaches the age of maturity.
That made me feel relieved, although I still needed to regain custody of Lily as soon as possible. Brian wouldn't even let me see her anymore, as the promise that I could visit her on weekends turned out to be another of his many lies to silence me. I needed to talk to Lily and make Brian pay in some way. So one day I decided to call him to tell him what the lawyer had said about Lily's inheritance. My intention wasn't to reproach him for anything, but simply to mention it as something trivial and observe his reaction.
What do you mean I wouldn't have access? That doesn't make sense.
That's what's in the will.
I haven't seen such a document. Are you sure you're not making it up?
Oh no. And I can tell you exactly where they keep it. I hoped Brian would end up being foolish enough to try to steal the will and get rid of it. After all, such a document was the only thing preventing him from getting his hands on the money. If that will cease to exist, the clause stating that I was the administrator of Lily's assets would also disappear. So, I gave him a false address, as I had planned before picking up the phone. Brian showed up there at night, taking advantage of the darkness and the silence of the night. He sneaked into the house without being seen, and just as he was in the middle of his search for documents in the supposed notary's office, he was caught in the act by a security guard whom I had hired expressly for that day, knowing that Brian would probably try something like this. The guard beat him up, using the baseball bat he had brought with him upon discovering an intruder in the office, and Brian ended up jailed for breaking and entering. Because of all this mess, not only were his shady intentions uncovered, but I was finally able to reunite with Lily.
I'm so sorry. He told me it was better for me to move in with him, that I was just a burden to you and you were better off without me.
He lied to you. He lied to both of us.
He was too good to be true. He was always kind to me until I started living alone with him. Then he treated me like an invalid and a nuisance. Sometimes he will lock me in my room and go out.
Despite the traumatic experience, everything turned out well. Brian was sentenced to prison for many years because, once they investigated him further, they also discovered that he was responsible for a multitude of similar robberies and scams that had taken place over the last decade. It seemed that his modus operandi was always the same: getting close to wealthy people to gain their trust and eventually rob them. It was lucky that we wouldn't see him anymore. Lily and I moved back in together, and eventually we collected our inheritance, learning a valuable lesson. We would never again let a third person come between us. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe.